If you don't already know me, my name's David. I'm one of the pastors at Exilic. We're living in an unusual time. Government leaders are wrestling with problems they haven't had to deal with before. Our healthcare workers are being stretched to the limits, sometimes even beyond their limits. And nearly every facet of our lives has been affected in one way or another by the virus. And so this raises some really good questions. I mean, one, like I mentioned in the this morning, if God is powerful and good, why is he allowing so many to suffer? Or if God is just, why are the poor the most affected in this time? Where is God in COVID-19? So we wanted to create this space where you could ask us any question you have. So to answer our questions, we have Pastor Aaron, Pastor Brian, Pastor Jay, and also Heidi, our college director. And you've already submitted some great questions, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let me grab our first one here. So, Pastor Aaron, I'll ask you this. How did Exilic make the distinction between trusting in God's care over us during this pandemic and obeying the city's orders not to physically congregate?
Yeah, so it was both a very easy and very difficult decision. It was an easy decision because it was the safest thing to do, and for everyone. It was the best way for us to love everyone, not only inside of our church, but outside of our church. But it was a difficult decision because we would be sort of canceling our in-person services. So it was both an easy and difficult decision. I would also say that if the person means that trusting in God is going to the Stewart Hotel, meeting face-to-face, despite our city, our government saying that it's not safe to do so, at that point, I would say you're not really trusting in God or having faith in God. It's more an act of foolishness. And so I think the wise thing to do would be to listen to what our city is saying and our health officials are saying. And that's sort of consistent with Romans 13 as well, where it says that we're called to obey our civil magistrates. Unless it's some sort of act of persecution or something like that. But in this case, the church is not being singled out or attacked. It's the whole world is being shut down. And so in this instance, it was a pretty easy decision to make, but it's still hard just because we're not able to meet together face to face. So the best way of loving our neighbors is actually and loving our church is actually by not meeting face to face.
Great. This question is for anybody then. Is this pandemic God's test of humanity? Who would like to answer that?
I can definitely understand and resonate with the feeling as if humanity is being tested, or maybe on a personal level you're being tested. But I think the ultimate test has already been taken, and that is, Jesus, his death and resurrection, and what he did for us bore an ultimate wrath. So whatever we're feeling now is not that, and it's just shadows of that. We live in a time that's called the already and not yet. So Jesus already came and suffered and died and rose again. But he hasn't come back again, so we're in this in-between time. So I wouldn't say it's a test of humanity, even if it feels that way. I don't think God is trying to test us, maybe trying to do other things that we don't know what or why for right now, but I think there's a level of trust, and maybe in the future, looking back, at least on a personal level, some things will be made more clear.
Great. Were you thinking about adding something to that, Jay, or?
Well, I think what Heidi said is great. I think that when we look at the scriptures, and COVID-19 in particular, it's an aspect of fallen creation. And so understanding from the biblical narrative that the curse of sin and the disobedience of our first parents, Adam and Eve, placed all creation under a curse. And it's really that general curse that we're all experiencing. So sometimes that kind of question comes from a certain point of view. As if, is there anything specific happening? And I think that this is a general suffering. It certainly reveals all of our hearts and reminds us of our mortality. And as Heidi said, I think ultimately when we're reminded of our mortality, reminded of our own weakness in something like this, it does cause us all to look to Jesus Christ But if what's behind that question is this about something more specific? I think the answer to that biblically is no. This is part of what it is to live in a fallen world. And one of the positive things that's happening in COVID-19, and I don't say this at all glibly because it's extremely tragic. We're 3 blocks from NYU and Bellevue, or in my apartment, and the loss of life is very palpable in New York City, and we feel that. It's impacted friends and family for us. But I think the collective spirit in New York and elsewhere that's come about, in the sense of being in this together, has been one small positive as we've walked through this together. But I don't think it's related to a specific issue that God is trying to get the human race for or teach the human race about.
There's a lot of overlap in this other question. Let me ask this one as well, though, because it's slightly different. Because you mentioned punishment, but this question says, is God disciplining us with this pandemic, both believers and non-believers? And if so, how do we not take every suffering to be a form of discipline?
So what I would say is that there are probably about 10,000 things that God is doing from his perspective, and we probably know about 3 of them. So it's hard for us to assume that we exhaustively know all 10,000 things that God is doing. And so those kind of questions are a little bit difficult to answer because it's not always a one-to-one correlation. Brian gave a good example. John 9 is another good example of a blind person. And the disciples say, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents? And Jesus said, none of them sinned. But this was in order for God's glory and his works to be displayed. And so I don't know whether this is a test or a discipline or whatnot. There are probably 10,000 different things that are all intermingled, but I do know that somehow God's glory and his marvelous works are going to be displayed through this. That for sure I can say.
Let's see, there are a couple questions about grief. So let me ask this. What does biblical grief look like, and how can we grieve alongside those who are in serious struggle and suffering?
I can take the first pass at this one. So for those who joined the noontime prayer sessions, Pastor Jean actually went over, I think it was John 11, where Lazarus dies and is brought back to life. And there you see a picture of Jesus grieving. You see him hearing of Lazarus's death, and the words are, he was deeply moved or deeply troubled. And he actually weeps. That's probably the verse everyone knows is the shortest verse in the Bible of Jesus wept. And so I think there we see a couple things. One is death is not a natural thing. Jesus hates death, something that Pastor Jean was saying in that reflection. And he's not just sad, he's angered by it. And so I think for us, biblical grief might look like being sorrowful and potentially being upset, but the object of even our anger is not God. The object of our anger is death itself. And so I think that's a picture of grief, at least from a story in the Bible. But I think ultimately grief, even when we're sad, we're not pushed to despair. Paul talks about this, and we're sorrowful and we're not defeated, and we're not hopeless. And so the grief that we experience as Christians is a temporary grief, but by all means it's necessary, and just to push your emotions and kind of that under the rug, I don't think is healthy as well.
Did you have any thoughts to add to that, Brian?
Yeah, thanks for that, Heidi. I'm thinking about all the instances in the scripture where people have really grieved and been sorrowful because of hardship, and pretty much it's the Old Testament. The people of God have been under oppression by so many different ruling powers, and they're really starting to question God's promises for his people. I think maybe just one slice at this would be to say that biblical grief is totally honest. And I think there's an invitation to just pour your heart out to God about your grief, about your genuine sorrows. Psalms is definitely one place to turn. Another place to turn is the letter of Habakkuk, where the prophet of God is really just kind of having this dialogue with God and saying, look, this is really depressing. This is hard. I don't know why you're not acting. And it seems to me that in the scriptures, through the scriptures, we see that God gives us space to sit in the muck and mire, as it were, and to tell him about it. So maybe start there. If you are grieving during this time, the God of the scriptures invites you to just be honest and to be real with your words and your thoughts.
David, I have maybe 10 seconds on this. I'm actually glad the person asked the question because just to piggyback off Brian, 1/3 of the Psalms are about grief and lamentation. The other thing I would say is that HBR, Harvard Business Review, came out with an article a few weeks ago called, I don't remember the title, but I think in the article it said that thing that we're all feeling right now, that thing is called grief. And the author was saying it because as modern Westerners, we're not really accustomed to feeling grief. If anything, we sort of totally distance ourselves from it and we shelter ourselves from it. And so I think the question is good in the sense that this is something that we should process and we shouldn't just move to the side. It's healthy for us to lament. It's actually emotionally very healthy for us to do this. So.
That's good. Thanks, guys. So this next question has quite a few upvotes. It says, I know how I can comfort my Christian brothers and sisters. How do I comfort my non-Christian friends when they're feeling hopeless about COVID?
David, I think one thing we can do with unbelievers is sort of piggyback on the last question is to, if we feel comfortable doing so, I think we can say the way that we draw strength in grief. And a lot of people have misconceptions about faith, and just from a personal narrative, not in a way that directs them, but one to identify with what they're feeling and to acknowledge that and express in kind of descriptive ways a recognition of that. By mean descriptive ways, like, I remember one of the most tragic experiences I've had, a pastor said to me, "What in the world?" That was his response when I told him what happened. So, what in the world? And then we can share how we take our griefs to God, and that we're invited to do that. And I think that's one way that we can begin to do that. It's a great question because I felt that same awkwardness myself, and I think the safest way is to just give our own story.
That's great. Any other thoughts on that from anybody?
I would just add, just be a good friend. And so it's not like you have to herald the gospel to them if the opportunity comes to it. But I think the most important thing is just to simply be a good friend for them. And oftentimes that means not saying anything. It just means being by their side, because that's what friends do.
Yeah. I think when people experience certain kind of pinches in their life, certain kind of stresses, it can often be a good opportunity to just be, just piggyback off of what Aaron was saying, just to be a great expression of love for your friend. The Bible tells us to love people. It doesn't tell us to just love Christians and non-Christians. And sometimes just a gesture to check in by text can really go a long way, or to deliver by Uber Eats a meal, or if you're reading something interesting about evil and suffering during this time of pandemic, and you know that your friend is interested in articles about this and that, maybe you can shoot it their way, and it can be kind of a it's not very direct. I mean, that's something that you could do just all the time, not just during a pandemic. And so just checking in with people, trying to have conversations around topics of the day.
Thanks. This next one has a couple upvotes as well. It says, how can I work towards having a gentle spirit in the midst of COVID-19 when many of the circumstances and adjustments are frustrating?
I'll chime in for a little bit. So the word gentle in the Bible doesn't necessarily always mean tenderness. More often than not, the word gentle means composure, poise, and centeredness in the midst of all the chaos around you. And I think one of the ways, I mean, I touched upon it a little bit today in the sermon, but one of the ways of being more centered is by making your heart happy in God every morning that you wake up. And there are certain ways that you can do it. And so I talked about sort of taking an inventory of your feelings, processing them, asking why you feel this way, and then sort of repenting of those things. And going through that 3-step process is very helpful in terms of centering yourself back on God in the midst of the chaos around you. If you don't do that, or if you neglect what you're feeling, and you neglect repenting and surrendering, then the frustration levels are going to continue to be there. And so that's one way of being poised and anchoring yourself on a daily basis.
Great. Let's see. Well, I can answer this next one here. It says, this question is for Pastor David. What has it been like being married to a nurse on the front lines? So my wife, Mi-Fung, for come like maybe week 2 or 3 or so of the shelter in place, her floor became exclusively for COVID-19 patients. So at first she had some, and then it was only COVID-19 patients. So she was as on the front lines as you can get, being a registered nurse there. I know many of you are in a similar situation. I think, some of the things you read about in the news were definitely true. Like the hospitals were slowly getting more crowded. So she works at NYU Langone here, which I hear I think it's probably significantly worse actually, like maybe in Queens, for example. But even here in Midtown, it was definitely getting more crowded. So they're taking care of more patients than they normally would. Still a huge shortage of personal protective equipment. So dealing with the stresses of that. So I think for me, we weren't so much worried about our physical health. I kind of just expected I would get the virus at some point, and I wasn't really too worried about it personally, and neither was she. But it was more stressful for sure. So I think as a husband, I was just trying to be more gracious, find more ways to serve her, make sure I could make her dinner and things like that. I think it was mostly about how I could be a good husband at the time and serving her, and just the stresses of just kind of busy work, more so than us necessarily being worried about our own physical health, but still definitely a lot of stress. And so for me, it was just trying to be all the more gracious and serve her in more ways. Let's see. So this is a good question too, I think. It says, how can I ask God to help with a situation not related to the pandemic? Am I being greedy by asking for help with an issue that is not affecting everyone?
No. I think the answer is no. I think about, the prayer of Hannah in the first book of Samuel, where she is just crying out every day, asking for a child, asking for a son. But you have to remember the historical context. I mean, it's the time of the judges, really. There's crazy corruption with the religious leaders of the day. I mean, the people are just not living according to how God had wanted them to live. And so I guess you could argue that it was a time where there were some big prayers needed for the people of God. But Hannah's at the temple praying for a son. Now, you could see that as selfishness, but again, I'd say when you search the scriptures, there is an invitation to pray and to pour out just what's on your heart. And one of the things that we talk about kind of in, our Presbyterian circles with our catechisms is that prayer is really an opportunity to align your will with God's will. Now, the thing about it is that God's will doesn't change. It's a ruler. And so what that means is that our will is the thing that is being kind of gauged against his. And so hopefully those aren't, these so-called selfish prayers, these prayers for yourself, right? They're not even selfish. They're just personal prayers, right? Hopefully, when you look at kind of the list of things that you're praying for, just kind of on a continuous basis, are they trying to pray things that God would want, as opposed to just things that you want? And so more and more, the idea is that our prayers would align with what God wants. I had a friend real quick who used to always say, yeah, I only pray what God wants me to pray. And so her prayers are always short. But she told me that, and it stuck with me over, I guess, a decade now. And I thought, I think that's right. Just pray what God wants you to pray.
To add on to that too, I think in hearing the question about being greedy with our prayers, I think it's helpful to remember that God is not a limited resource. He's not limited by any means. So like Brian was saying, we can go to him with anything, a child who's 5 years old or someone who's 55 years old and has prayer requests. Anybody can go to God with anything. And I think, remembering that, and also along the same lines of what Brian's friend was saying about, praying the thoughts of God. I think Pastor Stephen he's a pastor in Boston, once said that prayer is thinking God's thoughts after him. And I found that illustration to be helpful, where God has a will, he has a plan. And the more that we spend time with him in prayer, in the word, in community, with sermons and in church, the more our inner being will be transformed, so that we will be able to think his thoughts after him. I think it's intimidating a little bit for that statement to be made, and you're like, I don't know how to do that. And it's not something that you can figure out overnight. It's just like a lifelong walk with God that happens.
Quick thing I would also add on is that if it helps with your conscience a little bit, is that big problems don't mean that our small problems are unimportant. They're still important, and if he's a good father, you should bring your smaller problems that are important to him.
That's great. Let's see. How should we turn the other cheek with racism towards us and or others during COVID?
So I've actually experienced a little bit of this. Early on, someone came up to me and they were like, hey, this is like when the whole thing was starting. Someone came up to me and they were like, hey, things are pretty bad back at home, aren't they? And at first I thought they were talking about like my family, but he was talking about where I'm from. And I think a good way of I wish I handled it better, by the way. I didn't, but I think a better way of handling it than the way I handled it is to, first of all, recognize your dignity and worth as a child of God, and your own identity, being secure in that. Because if you're not secure in that enough, you are going to respond in difficult ways. And so remembering that. And then secondly, a lot of the times it's stemming out of ignorance. Sometimes it's just outright hatred, but a lot of times people just don't know any better. And so responding with compassion is typically better. And if you respond that way, it's easier to win them over, because hatred tends to breed more hatred. And most of all, you sort of, I say this all the time at church. If you're bitter towards someone, it's like, it's really the equivalent of you drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. Meanwhile, your own insides are burning up with acid. And so it's not healthy for you either. And so again, remembering that you are a child of God, this is your dignity and worth. So you don't have to respond in negative ways because you're secure, hopefully. And then secondly, responding with compassion is usually the best way of going.
Let's see. What about where did it go? Here it is. How do you stay gospel-centered each day while staying home? Do you have a specific routine, and how do you stay motivated?
So in the mornings when I wake up, I try, I think every other day, to do a 45-minute workout. The quality of that workout is sometimes questionable, but yeah, I try to do that every other day. And then after that, I'll listen to the Bible. I found that listening to the Bible has been helpful, especially as I'm listening to the prophets, and just kind of trying to take in everything that was happening at that time and why the prophets are saying certain things. And then just spending some time meditating, not doing like a super in-depth Bible study, but just kind of, being still and just meditating on a few verses or a passage. And then kind of going about my day. At noon, I typically join the noontime prayers, Monday through Friday from 12 to 12:20. And I think each person that leads has kind of shared that it's a nice time to sort of recenter on your day because you've been up for a couple of hours working or whatnot. And then, yeah, it's nice to come together and pray. And then, throughout the week, there'll be CG. Sometimes there's other prayer times for, college ministry or what have you. So I think even though we can't meet together, still trying to create that semblance of community, even though it's not perfect, while also making sure that I protect my individual time with God.
Then let's see, where did this one go? I think it just got a vote, so it moved. Okay, here it is. It says, how should Christians respond / talk about the actions / inactions of our government? Is it okay to criticize our leadership?
So I'll start, and then maybe some of the other guys can jump in. But we're not only citizens of heaven, but we're citizens of earth. And so as a citizen of earth, we have a responsibility to sort of keep our government accountable in certain ways. And so if there are actions or inactions that you agree with or disagree with, you should have opinions on that, and you should express those opinions, particularly if you really, really disagree with some of the inactions that are taking place. Why? Because you're not only a citizen of heaven, but you're a citizen of earth. And so as a citizen of earth, you should use the full rights that you have to express those things, whether it's in voting or, I don't know, writing letters or whatever it might be. And so I would go as far as to say that you have a responsibility to do so.
Yeah, I'm looking at 1 Timothy 2, classic text. First of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So it seems like the picture that Paul is giving to Timothy about how they should think about leaders is foremost through prayer, because it's prescribed that we lead a peaceful and quiet life, and we realize, especially in our day and age, where ideologies are so polarized, that you could do a pretty sizable damage if you're not careful about being really balanced in the way that you talk about politics. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, if you critique the president right now, I mean, you'll be seen as a Democrat or, like a hater, and you might just alienate. But the truth is, gospel-centered life, Christianity, really can't really be summed up in one political party and all of its views. And so I would encourage you, according to the scriptures, to take it to prayer, and maybe just share with only really trusted friends, where you know that there could be kind of a safe place to do that. Otherwise, I think the witness could be bad.
Just to, I would echo both of those sentiments. And from personal experience in this, we have 2 children in the New York City public schools. And we wrote to the mayor and to the governor and to the chancellor of the school district because New York City was late in closing the schools. And so we just expressed personal concern. We chose to do that personally. We also called representatives. I think when we think about responding to the political situation, you have the public responses, Twitter, media, Facebook, op-ed pieces. And I think some people are definitely called to do that, especially they're gifted and called. And as Aaron said, it's one of the beautiful things about providentially being placed where we are is we have that freedom. And I think that's fine to do that. But we also can exercise our callings. You may be touched in a particular way, and letting representatives know and letting people know, really how it's impacting you. Letting our leaders know through direct channels is also really, I think, useful. I think it does make a difference. And particularly with some of the problem with racism, I think I really want to say, first of all, I appreciate Exilic members being willing to open up and share their stories with me about that. That's made me more aware of what's happening. But yeah, expressing our concerns about policies and things like that, doing it directly is another way that we can do that directly to the leaders themselves.
That's great. Thanks, guys. This has had a handful of upvotes too. So let me ask this. It says, should we be wary of quoting Bible verses to comfort ourselves and one another if it's just for the sake of easing our concern/anxiety?
So interestingly enough, I mean, if you do quote the Bible, it says to do that. So for example, 1 Peter 5:7, Peter is writing this again. Keep in mind, he's a fisherman. He says, cast all your anxieties on him. And so here's a fisherman using the word cast. And so you can imagine Peter throwing a net overboard. And what he's saying is that instead of throwing a net overboard, cast your anxieties overboard. So in other words, don't keep it and repress it to yourself, but cast it onto his shoulders. And the last part of the verse says, because he cares for you. And so you can and you should do it because it's one of the most therapeutic, cathartic things that you can do that will give you the peace. So the Bible would only affirm us doing it.
Great. This one's kind of related. So let me ask this. Do that. As a Christian, should I worry about the safety of my friends and family? Does that mean I don't have faith?
I think concern for friends and family is just a natural aspect of love. So just simply say yes and then let somebody else expand upon that.
I think having faith doesn't mean that there's an absence of circumstances, negative circumstances, or the absence of a feeling of some sort of anxiety or worry. But I think, real faith is having a quiet confidence that in the midst of 19, in the midst of whatever circumstance you're facing, that there is a God, like Aaron was saying, who can bear all of your anxieties and who does care for you. So I think it's, definitely valid to be worried about your parents, your siblings, your friends, but that worry for them doesn't become, like I was saying earlier, an ultimate thing. It becomes something that you're able to bring to God and just tell him, hey, look, I'm worried about the health of my parents. I ask that you would protect them. And, he will work through that. And he wants us to come to him with these kinds of things.
Let's see. There's a couple questions kind of related to idolatry in a couple different ways. Let me ask this one. At what point does our legitimate grief/struggle over the changes to our lives turn into an unbiblical idolatry of comfort/lifestyle?
Yeah, I touched upon it a little bit today, but there is a difference between self-care and selfishness. And so self-care, the point of it is to get input, to do output, to love God and others more. Selfishness, it really ends with yourself. You're doing it to love yourself more, and it's not really for the sake of others. And so there you can see the distinction between the two. And so we have to be careful during this quarantine that we're not going from self-care to selfishness, because that line can get really, really blurry. And so I'll toss the ball to the other guys. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, any other thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, I mean, probably for all of us during the quarantine, we're feeling sort of unprecedented discomforts. That's not necessary. Well, I think when we're under duress, your true colors show. And what starts to rise to the surface are things that maybe you didn't know that were there, or you knew that it was there, but it's really coming out kind of full blown. And I think it's a great opportunity to be in a place of reflection about those things for sure. I'm not exactly sure when that crossover would be. I think it'd be hard to say. It'd be highly subjective. But probably in some, if you did a little bit of reflection over the word and seeing yourself in contrast to biblical outlines for lifestyle, and basically assessing the quality of your worship. I think probably during the quarantine, all of us are realizing things about things that we really worshiped, like really worshiped. And if those things take an inordinate amount of your time, your devotion, your thoughts, if something encroaches onto it and threatens it, you do kind of react and kind of lash out in different ways. And so I would just be on the alert about those things.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is I think this time of quarantine, it is very revealing, as Brian and Aaron were saying. And I think here in the West too, we have this privilege of growing up with a lot without realizing how much we have. Not just possessions, but just the fact that most everyone can get some sort of higher degree, or has the opportunity at least to apply to college. And when all of those institutions that we had built our lives around come to a halt, it almost seems as if our own personal paths are now halted because we can't apply for that other degree, or we can't get that job, or our offer is pulled, or there's a hiring freeze. And so while these things are not, bad things by any means, maybe they were things that we had put too much of our weight and our hope against, to the point where when they are shaken, we feel very, very shaken. And so I think for each person, whenever, I think God will do the job of convicting us. So whenever he kind of convicts you and prods you, and you realize, oh, maybe I am spending a lot of my emotional energy and thoughts on this particular thing. Maybe that's the point for you personally, where it has become an idolatrous thing, but I don't think it's so black and white, and you can draw a line in the sand to determine that.
Thanks. Let's see. Let me ask this one. How do you help non-believers process this pandemic to then ask more questions about faith in God? So Jay, you mentioned one way of this, but curious if you guys have any other thoughts on this question.
So the example I use all the time is, imagine we're in an iron box and there's no windows, and this is the only world that we know. How do we get people in the iron box to see that there is another world that's out there, a transcendent world? And one of the ways of lifting up that box is stories, which we tell a lot at our church. But another way of lifting up that iron box to see that there is a transcendent world out there is pain and suffering. Pain and suffering will lift it up. And so obviously pain and suffering is not something we can inflict on people, but it's inevitable. So it will happen. And so right now people are experiencing pain and suffering. So we have I know that everyone wants this quarantine to end, and we're looking, and it seems like forever, but from an evangelism perspective, I see this quarantine as a very short amount of time that we have to capitalize on this and to use it for the sake of God's kingdom, because people feel very existential right now. And because people feel very existential, they're asking these questions. And so if you have that opportunity, do not let it go. Jump on that, probe a little bit deeper, poke them in different ways, ask them why they feel about this. Use certain questions with, like, what's the difference between hope and optimism, like whatever. But I would say use this time to your advantage without letting them go, because the window's tight, it's gonna close, and then things are eventually gonna go back to normal, just like they did with 9/11. People stop asking those existential questions eventually. So we have a tight window that we can use right now.
Just to add to what Aaron said, invite them into our communities, I think is a great way. I've got a neighbor that I'd had some opportunity to talk to through different aspects of pain and suffering in their life. And they actually approached me and said they were listening to Jesus Christ Superstar, which is not the Bible, but it was their way of saying, I'm thinking about these things. And I need to follow up with them and say, hey, you're doing this. You want to listen to something that we're doing at church? And I think exactly as Aaron said, the door's open for that now in a unique way. And that door could close. And we have so many great things happening. So I'm thankful for our church in that.
Great. Well, I think we just have time for maybe one or two more questions. Let me ask this one. It's a little bit similar to some things we've asked, but I think there might be some good thoughts on this still. It says, how can we structure our prayers in the right biblical way, i.e. praying for the world's healing from this virus, but also trusting in God's will?
I think one of the things that we should be praying is for this virus to come to an end. A lot of people are getting sick and a lot of people are dying. Our economy is broken down. So we should pray that there's a vaccine found and that this curve is completely flattened and that this virus is destroyed and sent to the bottom pits of hell. So that's something that we should pray for. And at the same time, we say things like, not my will, but your will be done. And so when you will, whatever you will, we trust you. And so sort of having that balance between the two.
I completely agree with Aaron. We ought to be pleading for the Lord for a solution to the crisis. Just one very practical thing that people have probably even heard before is you can if you're looking for ways to voice your prayers, Psalm 13 is a great lament, Psalm 88, the Lord's Prayer, and you can actually maybe paraphrase, use that as a guide and kind of write your own prayers if you're really looking for models of prayer.
Then maybe just last question. This one's a little bit different, so let's end with this. Have you seen any good come out of this pandemic?
I think so. I can start. I'm sure we have, all of us kind of have examples of great silver linings during this time. I think personally for me, it's been great hanging out with my parents. I'm in Jersey. One of the things that I most missed was spending time with my dad. And after Jesus and Jeannie, there's no other person I'd rather spend my time with. He really is kind of a best friend. And so on my morning walks with him, we walk maybe like 4 to 5 miles every morning together. But when we do that, it's been great just kind of drinking from his wisdom and asking him questions about life and talking about this. And my dad and I, we take jabs at each other all the time. It's just been a great time of hanging out. But if it wasn't for the pandemic, I wouldn't have really had this kind of time with my dad. And I don't know if I'll ever get this time back. And so, in one way, a lot of my relationships have been kind of put on hold, even though we can meet up virtually, it's just not the same. But on the other hand, it's been just really fantastic. And so such a privilege for me to just spend time with my guy, with my dad.
I think for me, just there's a couple things that come to mind. One, the city of New York. It's amazing to see the amount of resources that the city has, and they all existed before. Like, they were all there before. It's just now this pandemic has made it very urgent for those resources to be easily accessible, readily available for people to know about them. And so I've seen at the company I work at and just through churches and other online forums, people putting together like consolidated documents on how to get help, or like food shelters, and how to support other small businesses, how to support churches and nonprofits. So I think that was a good thing, where it was cool to see the city come together at that level and try to support one another. And then even within, or especially within the church community, I think there's just like a lot of stories. I don't know if he's on the line, but there was a college student actually the first week or two that the pandemic got pretty bad, and he put together this like fasting prayer schedule type thing. So just seeing like the creative ways that people are like, not, I don't want to call it leaning into their faith, but really using this time to intentionally spend time with God, and it's for the purpose of praying over the city, praying for those who are sick. So that's just one example of an encouragement within the church.
I would just add to that by saying, I mentioned my kids typically being daycare 9 to 6. They're now here, so we've had to give them new rhythms and patterns. And one of the things that we do is Bible time in the morning as soon as we get up. And so we have Bible time. I ask them questions, and Logan knows like 20 catechism questions now. She knows like there are 3 persons in the Trinity, but he's one God. She knows that Adam and Eve got a very long time out. She knows that a covenant is a pinky promise. So I mean, I know that I'm one of the pastors at the church, but we never do family worship ever. But we've actually been able to do that for the first time, and it's gone really, really well. So I'm really thankful to that. And I'm also thankful for our church, because one of our visions for this year was to grow smaller, because we're growing bigger. And I think Jonah was the first person to say God has answered our prayer, and he's answered it in manifold ways. We are much smaller than ever before. I preach to myself and by myself, and in front of an iPhone. And so we are smaller than ever before. But despite that, our community group attendance is higher than ever before. And there's silver linings there.
I would say that I completely agree with everything that's been said. We've had some great family times together as well. It seems like in this pandemic, there's been tragedy and then there's been beautiful things along with it. So the human spirit, what divine image bearers in New York City will do for one another is just been incredibly encouraging and humbling. I think the appreciation for the worker is also incredibly encouraging, but also incredibly humbling, because if you look at the map who's died of COVID-19, the economic disparities and racial disparities are clear there. And so that's humbling as well. So I think this pandemic has been, there's a silver lining in a sense, but I think it'll be important for us to carry those linings forward as we reflect upon what's happened and not forget what we've seen.
COVID-19 has been a great teacher for us.
I think about Exilic and just a shout of thanksgiving to our God. Something that I'm realizing is if you were to think about this quarantine as kind of a hibernation, and that you have to go some distance, some time without having to eat again, having the old routines of having to meet at church and things like that, a regular diet as we knew it. I'm realizing that actually our church was already at a level of health to be able to sustain this winter and this hibernation. And I'm seeing it in the ways that the Spirit is really giving us new, but also the ways that He's worked in the past to give us a unity of community, a love for each other, and also just with the recent Hope for New York match thing that happened in 5 days, over 42K that we raised. And I think for other events, if we did it in the past, we could have probably done something similar. But it just shows the kind of preparedness and the readiness the church was already at, just by the grace of God, to just respond just immediately in such a big and impactful way. And so I'm realizing how much Exilic is loved by God, and how our church is so blessed by God that we are now kind of at some point where we're looking almost just ready to be an even more generous kind of a church. It's been altogether really encouraging.
That's great. Thanks, guys. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Hopefully it was helpful. And we didn't get to all of your questions, so feel free, if you still have a question, or if more questions come up, you're always welcome to email us. We will do our best to either reply to your email or find a time we can chat over Zoom, even potentially. So don't hesitate to do that. Let me just close this in prayer. God, we do ask, as Aaron said, we ask that you would bring an end to this virus, God. This virus has caused already so much suffering, and it's not over, and we know that there's going to be suffering even in its wake. And so we ask that you would bring an end to this virus, God, and help us to draw near to you in this time. Thank you that you promised to draw near to us as we seek you. And so I ask that you would actually grow our faith in this time, and that you would even give us opportunities, like we talked about, to share our faith with those who don't know you, and ask that you would be working in hearts, that you would be drawing people to yourself in this time. Give us wisdom for how we can respond to questions, God, and may our faith point people to you. We ask that you would continue to make us a generous church in this time, that we would reach outward and serve our city and our world, starting with our own family and friends and roommates, and moving beyond that, God. Thank you that you are working good, even small little things that we can see even now, God. Help us to trust that this is all for your glory. Help us to trust that when we can't always see how that's true, God. So please grow our faith in this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Hopefully we will see each other soon in person.
you.